listening to the 14th source for all geeky nerdy news and discussion, which means that you're listening to a podcast.
For all intents and purposes.
I am D. Bethel.
And I'm Andrew Asplund.
And we are your two overeducated, codependent nerd hosts, bringing you the things that we like to talk about, but filtered through inquisitive, critical lenses. In the episode for Friday, October 4th, 2024. Oh, I just got the chills, Andrew. It feels spooky.
It's Spooky-tober, my friend.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
So we're going to
That's
talk
what happens when both of us
stuff.
have our birthdays. Then just evil shows up.
Right. It's like, well, oh no, Andrew's birthday starts, and then Dan's, and then darkness.
Right? Just dominoes falling, really. And I will say, dear listeners, in the green room, Andrew and I might have actually made a plan
to do something spooky.
We'll see. We'll
see if we actually, pull the trigger on that.
Instead, we'll be like, "Hey, what'd you do in Fallout 76?"
Right.
Which we could talk about. It's been a minute since we talked about that. But this week, we're going to quickly check in with kind of how things are going in terms of our nerdy and geeky selves. Because both Andrew and we say this every week. It's just even more true. We're busy. Things are happening. We are
both busy.
Yeah, I'm working my way through 130 papers. I'm about halfway through. I'm doing okay. Andrew, you just started a new gig, and it seems to be going well. Just mild panic at all times.
Right. So I started, other than my day job, I'm now also teaching an undergrad course.
Right. In addition to your day job.
Yeah. In addition to,
right.
And it's one I've never done. So really, for me, the panic is kind of like, okay, I have a basic plan, but it's like, okay, shit. Figuring out the week to week. And I love the fact, I will say this, a good friend of mine who's a middle and high school teacher, when I said like, oh man, no, I'm like, before the quarter started, I was like, I don't even have anything prepped other than like my syllabus in the first couple days. And he basically was like, well, that's all you need as long as you're one day ahead,
That's what I hear from like, especially like middle and high school teachers, like just stay one chapter ahead, my friend. Like, all right.
And I don't like that, but that's where I feel like sometimes I am right now. But yeah, that's been my professional life.
That's your professional week in geek.
But let's talk about
your week in professionalism.
Life.
Yeah, there we go. But we got that out of the way. So Andrew, what has your week in geek been like this week?
Oh, so it is Spooky-tober. So I watched a horror show.
Impossible.
Yeah, I did. I watched I'm joking. I actually watched the pilot for the new Paramount show, Matlock. Now, hold on, everyone. And honestly, like, normally this is kind of like, this is not something I would normally think is what we talk about, but there's something about it that actually, like, that. So a friend of mine actually texted, like, oh, I watched the new Matlock. It was pretty good. I was like, whoa.
Right.
Like, what? Like Andy Griffith?
No, no offense. Like, actually, this is perfect. Like, there have been many, many weeks in geek where you have been like, I watched the reboot of an old 70s, 80s, or 90s show. So this is kind of in your wheelhouse.
This is, but there's something weird about it that, like, and I will say, I'm going to talk about this. There is going to be a pretty big spoiler for the pilot. But it's also a spoiler for the premise of the show.
Which they changed their name from Matt Unlock.
Right, it's Matt Unlock.
To Matlock.
So this is, it's not a reboot. It's a show that's inspired by the original. Where am I going with this? So this is a show that stars Kathy Bates as is this woman, Madeline Matlock, and we see her.
She's awesome. So okay.
And it's basically like the show opens with her, like we see this old woman, because she's an old woman, right? She is like in a cafe, and you start to realize that like she's this old lady that no one pays attention to, but she's still very sharp, and she's basically listening to people having conversations. And that becomes the whole first like 10 minutes of the episode is her essentially like conniving her way into a prestigious law firm.
Okay.
And showing up at like the senior partners meeting, kind of like out of the blue, like who the fuck are you? Right. Yeah. It's that it almost has this kind of like grifter aspect of her getting through security, getting through whatever, doing these kind of like games of getting through
spoilers,
things.
everybody. Yeah.
and it's like, oh, she basically says, oh, I'm an old woman, you know, I was a lawyer, I need a job, and hey, you guys, you could use me. And that's the premise of the first 10 minutes is like, this is an old woman who, you know, I think she even says she's raising a grandson because her daughter died. And she needs a job. She was a lawyer in the 90s. Oh, and by the way, her name is Matlock, just like the TV show.
What? Wait, really?
And, yeah,
wow.
and they meta that.
Okay,
where it's like,
okay.
oh, no, my name's Madeline Matlock, just like the TV show. And that's the first time, that was the first moment where I was like, wait, what?
This is interesting.
Is it a reboot or whatever? Like, but you're like meta referencing the thing that the like, you know, that's weird.
I know exactly that your antenna went right up as soon as that happened. You're like, what?
Because that's a weird thing, right? Like, and so it ends up being a very like whatever 50, 60-minute long episode where it's a very lawyer thing where you see her like trying to prove herself as someone who should be at this prestigious law firm. She interacts with the other characters. She helps them like not only like win, you know, get more money on some lawsuit. She also helps them win this case that's like the big case that is the center of the episode. She endears herself to one of the main characters. And you're like, okay, it's just a fucking lawyer show, except this weird thing where like she keeps saying like the TV show, right?
Yeah.
To the point where like at the end, near the end of the episode, where it's like, oh, you won the case, and it's like the two junior associates are literally playing the Matlock theme on their phone with a picture of Andy Griffith, and it's this like weird like,
oh okay, my gosh, sounds great. What is
this show, right? And that's kind of like it is this kind of like I say it's this lawyer show that old women watch, and I say that because my mother watches all of them, and in fact,
who's young and vibrant.
No, she's not. She's in her 70s. But it's very much just. It's
I stand by what I said, Andrew.
It kind of has this like generic lawyer show feel, except for that weird meta thing of like, but you're openly referencing the thing this show is based on. And she says like, oh, I'm Maddie Matlock, just like the TV show. And you're like, okay, that's really weird. But then there's a point at the very end where they're like, oh, she's going home. And again, this is a big, huge spoiler. But it's also like...
I have no idea what's coming next. This is going to be awesome.
It is like this weird meta thing that like, I think if you knew this going into the show, you would appreciate it differently. Where you see her like, oh, she gets on the bus. Oh, I got to take the bus home to get to my grandson. I have to raise him. She gets on the bus, and then it shows her getting off at the next stop. She walks around the corner, and there's a man in a very nice, luxurious car waiting. It's like, oh, hey, Marcus, take me home. And she gets in the back seat, and you're like, wait, what? And then she pulls up to this palatial estate. And she gets out, and the whole thing is she said, like, well, my husband died. He gambled too much and drank too much. Yeah, my daughter, whatever. And she comes home, and there's her husband. And they're like, oh, how'd it go? Like, oh, it went well, blah, 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 whatever. I'm getting in with them. And there's this whole like, wait, the whole story she's told the whole episode has been not entirely false, but like there's bullshit. Like she's actually
a mild grift. Yeah.
She's clearly this well-to-do woman with a husband and a grandson. But it's like the reveal that like, oh, this is all a grift. She's trying to accomplish something. She's trying to essentially get vengeance for the death of her daughter. And that she adopts this name Matlock because she knew it'd be like the TV show.
So her name isn't Matlock. Okay, I gotcha.
Right. And it's like, wait, so this has all been like a scam on the viewer, you know, but also on the other characters.
Yeah. So I looked it up. The episode has, I'm not sorry. The show has received an 18-episode order. So this is airing on actual ass TV, right?
I believe so.
As well as, it does. And so, like, that was my first thing. Like, how many episodes are they doing of this? And it seems to be not as long as, like, 24 or 26, but a fair amount, right? But especially with that premise, my first thought is, like, how long do they expect this to go? They can't tease out that revenge plot for
right. So
for seasons, right?
like it had a certain like so having I remember watching my parents watch Matlock in the 90s or whatever 80s.
You were just sitting on the floor watching your parents as they watched TV. It was super weird.
It was a very generic. It was a Perry Mason-esque like here
sure. Which also got a really interesting reboot from HBO.
The folksy Georgia lawyer does the thing and whatever. So it starts with kind of that feel, but a little bit different. But then it's like the reveal that like, oh wait, is this a show where the main character like she's trying to get in on this law firm? And there's things where they like she kept asking weird questions about like, oh, you guys represent pharmaceutical companies, and you're like, oh, that's a weird thing to ask or whatever. And of course that's part of it. It's like, again, the premise is her daughter died from an overdose or whatever, and she basically wants to burn down these companies. And it's like, oh. What a weird, and the reason, to me, it really stood out is, again, I'll watch lawyer shows because that's what I do, but this one has this weird,
Is that one of the requirements of keeping your license?
Yes, I have to, in fact, I get CLE credit for watching this.
It's Matlock especially, you're doing extra bonus points for that.
But it's that weird thing where, for me, what stood out, and the reason I wanted to talk about it, was this, idea that they took it as, oh, it's a reboot, but it's not. Yeah. And it's weird meta, but then there's the meta twist on it where it's not just going to be this she's just doing the thing that the old guy did. There's this but there's a vengeance subplot.
Right. One of the interesting things is that it's actually like a modern take. It's a modernist take that is more than just I'm his daughter or whatever, right? It's actually a clever and I think the word that comes to mind is appropriate kind of approach to a reboot instead of just either being a complete reboot or even the more, I guess, traditionally was more of a progressive take, which is we are going to try to continue what happened from before. Because isn't that what Quantum Leap did? It was kind of a continuation,
so Quantum Leap
right?
definitely did a continuation. Whereas MacGyver and Magnum PI just did a reboot.
A straight up reboot, yeah. So some interesting things I did in my quick research here, Andrew. The director of the first two episodes is also one of the executive producers, Kat Coiro, who was also a director and executive who was also a director and executive producer for the She-Hulk show. Huh. And so there's some legal lineage there, but also a sort of not straight ahead, more interesting take on a legal drama, right? And that brings with it some interesting lineage, I guess.
Well, I will say that apparently I didn't know this watching it, that the producer was, I think the showrunner, in fact, writer and producer, so it's showrunner, Jenny Snyder Ehrman, also did Jane the Virgin.
Oh yeah. She wrote the first two episodes too.
So it's this weird thing where it's not what I expected.
Right.
And
what was it?
And actually the friend who actually told me hey, I watched it, I liked it. When I told him wow, I was not expecting that twist. He actually said that's why that's what he thought for him he liked. He's going to watch it because of that. This idea that it wasn't just another fucking lawyer show, right?
Right. It kind of reminds me more of there was another reboot you brought to the show. What was it? Queen Latifah?
Oh, the Equalizer.
Yeah.
Which is weird because that one I kind of dropped off watching because.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, I think went through the 3 or 4 seasons. It was more that it's CBS. So I mean, this is still CBS. There's the point where you're oh, you're throwing some propaganda in there. And again, I also watch CSI, but The Equalizer had a little bit too much, with Queen Latifah in the main role, where she there's the thing where you got to obey the cops or something. I was oh wow, you propaganded that, okay,
right? So it seems like a really smart and appropriate way to approach a reboot. That is, and I say that not because it's because it's different, but because all the other tricks have like the traditional tricks have been done to death at this point.
Right.
Like either being a full reboot and not acknowledging the past, or somehow trying to continue what happened before. Like let's just do something sideways. And this is good. And the people behind it seem to also be very smart. And yeah, I'm actually very interested to probably check this out. It'd be a good kind of thing to have on the back burner whenever you need something to watch too. You know?
Well, I'll say that Kathy Bates,
Fantastic.
yeah. Did great, right? And that's probably part of it is that, they got someone who, and I guess if you think about it, right? The original show was Andy Griffith at a, very late stage in his career, but like it sold on the fact that it was Andy Griffith. Yeah. Now it's like this, to a certain extent, sells on the fact that it's Kathy Bates.
I'm reading here on the venerable website Wikipedia that, and it links to a story that was published in New York Times, that she said this is going to be her last role. So however long the show goes, once it's done, she's retiring. So
well, she is, she's earned it,
Yeah.
Sorry, I saw her birthday on IMDb. I'm like, let me do the math. I'm like,
she has to go home and smash some legs of kidnapped writers.
Is that? I think she's 76. Mm-hmm. So
hey,
yeah, you know what? Like, good on you. Like, do this one show. And I will say, like, she does. Like, there's this whole premise of the show that, like, one of her strengths, and again, it goes to the conceit, is that people don't pay attention to the old woman.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's like a whole thing where she like literally does like she's kind of not scams people, but like the like in the opening 10 minutes
she plays on their biases, right?
When she gets into the building, it's like, oh hey Tammy, can you open the door for me? My hands are full. It's like, well, she doesn't work there, but someone opens the door for her. right?
That's cool. Like, and she's always chosen interesting roles. I'm not going to vouch for all of them, but I like to see that, like, even in her, quote unquote her final role, like she does something that's left to center, And I'm not necessarily just talking politically, but like something that is just off kilter enough to be something that stands out, just like any of her major roles in her career. That's cool. That's cool.
So, I will say, I did not expect. I had not heard of the show. I wasn't going to watch it until a friend texted me.
I hadn't heard anything of this.
But now I'm like, oh, this is another one of these weird like old people shows that I'm excited to watch.
Well, when you told me before the show, I started watching Matlock. I'm like, oh God, Andrew, you just want to be 85 years old.
You thought I was going back to the original.
Like I already finished Murder, She Wrote. Guess it's time to go to Matlock. I'm like, God, but no, okay, there's a new show. Which that's not the scary part, but we'll see. We'll see how it does. But like, this is a major actress and a reboot of a major show. And I would figure I consider myself fairly plugged in. I hadn't heard anything. I mean, I have Paramount Plus. I watch shit regularly on Paramount Plus. Nothing. So that's kind of strange. But who knows? Maybe they're running ads in between political ads on broadcast TV.
Well, and I was going to say they're probably running ads. Clearly my mother had seen it. When I texted her, she's like, "Oh yeah, we watched it." So like, no doubt. The 70 to 85 demographic is getting adverts for this.
Even your parents are going like, Andrew, get with it. You're so behind. That is. They played all the new games. What are you waiting for?
Right, like. Really, it's this thing where it's like, I guess I just don't have the right YouTube commercials.
Guess not. That's cool. I'm glad it sounds interesting and unique, which is great.
And just what a weird, and again, the reason I want to talk about it just because of that weirdness, it's just, that was weird. I'm glad I got, like, part of me is like, well, I could have missed this. I'm so glad that my friend texted me. So I got to, because now think about like what that experience means of like, it's not a reboot. It's not a continuation. It's a weird sideways. And I'm glad I got to see it. And we'll see where it goes. I mean, apparently they ordered 18 episodes. I can't imagine they're going to go on too long.
Well, I said that when they did the fucking Blacklist, and that ended up 17 years later. Fuck.
So anyway, that was my week in geek. Dan, what about you?
I've been grading. I've been grading a lot of papers.
I get that. Been there.
Oh, man. What I will point out is haven't dug too deep into it, but I got a new book via Kickstarter, so full disclosure. But from a company that has produced really good works in this, let's just call it a genre. Mm-hmm. And it's nigh academic video game criticism.
Okay.
It's a company called Third Editions, who I've purchased a fair amount of books from before. But I think their most widely known kind of approach to video game criticism is publishing books on just like overviews of games. I have a book that's all about Final Fantasy VI, a book about the Metal Gear Solid series. Let me look. Oh, and a book on the creator behind like Shadow of the Colossus and Ico and The Last Guardian. And but they've done more than just video game criticism. Actually, my favorite book of theirs is a really good book on the legacy of the manga and film Akira by Otomo.
Okay.
A really good book, and it gives you really good insight into Japanese culture from the 80s and 90s that I just didn't know anything about. And so I got their new book that they had funded through crowdfunding, and it's called. And this actually lines up, Andrew, with some of your recent stuff. It's called Decoding The Last of Us, the Remnants of Humanity. And the first thing I'll say is the interesting thing about this publisher is that they are French, which is something I've always been not hesitant about, but I always worry about something getting lost in translation, especially with arguments and academic kind of probing of topics. But the translators they've always gotten on their books have been fantastic. It's very readable. It doesn't read like a literal translation, that they've taken the time to really translate the text to be readable, engaging, and focused on the arguments that I'm hoping the original authors are trying to make. But that's always kind of in the back of my mind. I'm like, is there something being left out? And I'm not going to learn French. I'm really trying hard enough with Spanish. Right? Duolingo tells me I'm trying real hard, Andrew. But that being said, the one thing that I like about this, one, it is a well-written book. I'm only through the preface at this point. There's something about The Last of Us that is, to me, and you haven't played the games, right? Because you don't need that kind of sadness in your life. But you've seen the show, which is bad enough. But to me, one of the things coming out of the games is like there's something kind of inherently American about the depression they show in those games. Because a lot of the set pieces are built around not only American nostalgia and pastimes, but also American consumerism, right? So like there's huge set pieces set in abandoned sports arenas, as well as walking down an open air mall kind of thing, right? And what I find interesting is like the writer gets it and has done their research not only into the academics of like ludonarrative importance and stuff like that, but also American culture. And like to the point where like one of the, before the preface starts, they like quote a song that's actually like a really deep cut from like the independent Americana music scene. And I'm like, wow, okay. It's from a band called the Steel Drivers, for those that know. And I'm like, all right, wow, this is okay. They get it. They know what they're talking about. And the song they quote from is very relevant to the themes of The Last of Us. And I'm really excited to keep digging into this book, not only because The Last of Us is good and I trust the writing, but also mostly because of my experience reading that Akira book, because it was a fantastic read. It took me a long time, as all books do, but just the writing is so crisp, so piercing, and so thorough that but never reads as, oh, this is a dissertation, right? Like this is a chapter I have to write to satisfy my chair, right? It's like there's the Akira book was really interesting because they spent a lot of time talking about like, oh, there's like this weird pseudo punk scene built around motorcycles that happened in Japan post, in the 50s and 60s that like I'd never heard about. And then when you learn about it, like, oh, I see how this is a huge puzzle piece that fits into the story of Akira that I would have missed otherwise. And it's funny because it plugs into something I wrote about for our site as well as the Long John site, where upon reading the first volume of Akira, one of the things that stood out to me was the sort of, for lack of a better word, youth gone wild theme. Like they're kids, teenagers that just have no supervision and no sense of self-preservation, and are just tearing ass through town, like on motorcycles, not even holding on to handlebars, and just like running into shit, like punching people and throwing pills at each other, and like it's all fucking chaos. I'm like, this is interesting, and only to read this book years later, and you're like, oh, that's like, there's context for that, right? And I don't know where they're getting these writers. They're all French, but man, they know what they're doing. And so I recommend checking out Third Editions Publishing, despite being a publication based in France, a publisher based in France, only using French writers at this point. But those writers know what they're doing. The translators know what they're doing. And if you just want like some, they've published a lot of books about a lot of games, and there's something for everybody at this point. I definitely recommend checking out one of their books, even though they can be a little expensive side. Their hardcovers are really beautifully published, but if you want to dive deep on a game or a series, it's a good place to go to. So I'm interested to be sad as I read the Last of Us book.
No, that's good. No, it's funny. You mentioned just thinking about Akira and Japanese motorcycle culture. My brain, I need to say this because of my own obsession, immediately went to Super Sentai shows, and actually also all the tokusatsu, because they all had motorcycles. Right, Kamen Rider,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
I never like. It was so weird, like watching like the Super Sentai shows, like the ones that inspired Power Rangers, and how like they had motorcycles that would show up in like a couple episodes. And a friend said like that's probably a sponsorship, and it probably was. But also there was just this weird thing where like they have
something seems
they have motorcycles. Like in fact, one of the shows I forget which of the Sentai shows, where the end credits is just them riding around on motorcycles for like fucking a minute and a half.
Yeah.
It's this thing where like just. And it's different than what like motorcycle gangs and stuff, but just this idea that there's a motorcycle culture, that's very different than what I see and what I understand. And I guess I should have understood this because the idea of Japanese motorcycles is a whole thing in America, right? Like, forgive the expression, but rice rockets as people call them, right? Like the Japanese speed motorcycles and stuff. It's so weird. Like, I guess we don't, to always see that and to be like, oh shit, that's like that makes sense. That explains something that I didn't understand. Now, like, of course, I realized that like, well, part of it's that you have these Japanese companies that literally make motorcycles.
Right. For those that are interested, it's a Japanese term called the bosozoku. Where that whole sort of motorcycle-based rebellion, and it was based around not only rejecting the status quo, especially in like the post-war like assimilation world with the West, assimilation vibe of assimilating with the West, I should say, but also like modification of your bikes, making it street illegal and like trying to be as dangerous as possible, right? And I can definitely see that. Like what culture does, especially culture with money does, is like let's saturate that and sanitize it for TV. And like, and they could also be superheroes, right?
Right.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
No, it's actually like it is. And again, then it makes me look back and reflect on American culture, and the way that what our TV was and everything else. I mean, I still think a lot about like the obsession with the Western in America.
Yeah, and it's transliteration into things like post-apocalyptic fiction, right?
And I will say, like, and really importantly, there's a whole commentary on the internet that's been around for a while that Dungeons and Dragons is not medieval European fantasy. It's a Western with the coat of paint of medieval European fantasy. Where like the idea of like
strangers walk into a bar,
right. No, there's only like, oh, you meet in a tavern, like, oh, you meet in the saloon, right? Like, oh, you go out, like you go from town to town solving problems. Like this is have gun will travel, right? This is like in the whole premise of making enough money until you can buy your own kingdom. Like that is not a Western per se, but that's very American.
I've never seen a Clint Eastwood movie where he's rolled a 1.
Right? Apparently not. He never did.
Yeah.
But I've seen actually. I remember what is it? Unforgiven.
Yeah.
Gene Hackman rolls a 1.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's in fact he then responds with misfire. I remember that scene.
Yep. Yeah. Actually, so you know what?
It's this weird thing where just And I get it. Like, this is like, art is culture and culture is art. Like, yes. But when you start to see the thing that you thought was like, oh, this is just this weird anime I watched as a kid. And like, oh, wait, where does this shit come from? Like what inspired that? And then
there's a context. Cultural context for sure.
And then you make Matlock. No, I'm teasing. Like,
well, actually, I mean, you bring it back. Like, what is The Last of Us but a very sad Western set in the post-apocalypse, right? It's definitely playing on those tropes as well.
Although I will say, I've said this before. I want to reiterate it that I explore zombie fiction and get depressed about how it's all this libertarian horse shit. The TV show Last of Us, not the game, because I know the game does it differently. The episode with the dudes,
Nick Offerman,
right? That
the Emmy Award-winning episode,
right? Like that is very much, I would say, antithetical to so much zombie literature, because it is like, no, this is how they became better, right? Like, right, that they realized that the isolationism and the American, like, no, I'm on my own. Like, no, actually, what you needed was somebody else. And it's that kind of stuff. Like,
dare I say the show might be better than the show.
I'm getting moody right now. I'm having emotions. Sorry.
Yeah, and that's what good criticism does. Not to bring in my day job for a minute, but like one of the things I have to fight against when talking about academic writing is that is the sort of switching discourse languages from pop culture to academic culture. And like criticism means something different, just stepping through the door of an English classroom in a sense. And that generally when we hear the word criticism, it means I'm here to tear you down. But good criticism is about looking at what something does well, and then not necessarily look at what something does poorly, but looking at what something could do better, right? And having that conversation, like, oh yeah, it's doing this thing, but like, could it be doing it better? Mm-hmm. And it's generally criticism isn't about anger or hate or that something is good or bad. But the unfortunate thing is, and this is where the two sort of discourses intersect, is that what gets more clicks,
right?
And that's why I like. Maybe it's bad. I have to reach to a publisher that is based in France to find some of the most actually penetrating and interesting and sort of in-depth kind of investigation of video games with third editions. And
I want to bring it back to us 20 years ago
when we started the podcast.
Well, no. I just I was thinking about this. I always think about it how Hideo Kojima, with Metal Gear Solid, I'm thinking of specifically, had this weird like quasi. For me, like as a youth, a Japanese man who grew up in Japan, raised in Japan, made this weird like America-centric,
right?
Like almost like America fan fiction.
Like
of what the idea, right? The premise, the promise, right? The idea that like it's not about this, it's about burr. Like he did that, and for me, like I remember playing it in the early 2000s, where I'm like, I'm a little kid that's going to join the military, and like here is a Japanese guy making a game that resonated with me more.
Yeah.
And like the challenge of the promise and the whatever. Like, yeah, I mean, that's why you say, oh, it's these French people. Like, but sometimes it takes the outsider to look in.
Absolutely. Right. I remember, I mean, there's naivete here, but I think it locks into kind of what you're talking about. But I remember finishing Metal Gear Solid in 98 or 99 or whatever it was and being like, because they're talking about nukes and stuff, and I've never seen that video game, and like I'm like, this is the most important video game I've ever seen, and like this is saying something important. I'm like, well, yeah, kind of, but the thing is, like, for a person whose main ingestion of a lot of my stories, a lot of the fiction in my life have been video games, to see a game even not only try to approach real life, controversies with even a little bit of a critical eye, even though it's not maybe necessarily the most effective or or thoughtful lens, it at least was a step forward, right? And I think probably like just getting me to think about things like nuclear weapons and war. Like, yeah, maybe it was a bit ham-fisted, but at least it got me thinking about that. It definitely shaped the way I think about the fiction I consume today.
Right.
And like you said, a Japanese developer. And maybe we should be looking. I mean, the main hurdle, and this can be a big hurdle, a tall hurdle, I guess is the word, is the translation. And whoever third editions have on staff to translate their books is doing a top-notch job. Do not fire those folks. Pay them more because they're doing a great job. These are great reads. Really good reads.
But that is always a challenge.
Yeah. Oh, boy. I own so many Vampire Hunter D translated novels, and they're all garbage, but I still own them because I'm a fanboy. But I think volume 1 of this Vampire Hunter D novel I have notes in the margins going like, whose cousin wrote this? Right? And let me just say, the Akira book I was talking about is from third editions. It's by Rémi Lopez, and it's called The Impact of Akira, a Manga Revolution. It's a very good book. I think of the third edition books I have so far, I haven't dug deep into the Last of Us book, but it's the best book I've read from them. It's a great look at both the manga and the anime as it speaks to the culture of Japan. It's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. They might even have digital versions of it if you are a Kindle person. Andrew.
Or other readers. I have a different reader.
Digital. Yes.
What's my other one?
You can buy a PDF is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Pocket book.
There we go. Sadness is great for academia. So if you, dear listeners, have any thoughts about the topics we discussed this week, feel free to leave your thoughts as comments on the page for this episode at forallintents.net.
You can also post your comments or engage in conversations with other listeners on our Facebook page.
You can find us on other social media as well, specifically the places that Andrew and I frequent, which means you can find me on Instagram at Bethel Comics, and you can find Andrew on Mastodon at profounddark@dice.camp.
While you're at our website at forallintents.net, you can also take a look at our YouTube page, which you can find by clicking on the link in the corner that says YouTube. There we have our show, simulcast in YouTube. If you are listening to the show on YouTube, please like and subscribe and ring the bell, I believe is the term. I don't know, man. I don't know YouTube.
You're doing great.
That's the thing where I thought for the longest time I was saying the right words. I realized that there's two different sets of words.
I say those words in class and the children laugh.
I know, but like it's that thing but there are multiple words.
That's how language works. Subject, verb, object, Andrew. Oh boy. We use two tracks of music for our show. One is called Disco Medusi, the other is called District 4, both written and performed by Kevin MacLeod, the Clan MacLeod, immortal swordsman, graph paper enthusiast, and musician extraordinaire.
You can find his music and more at incompetech.filmmusic.io, and that's all licensed under the Creative Commons 4.0 Attribution License.
If you'd like the show and like to help us out, the best way to do so would be to subscribe to the show using whichever podcasting service you happen to prefer. What would help us out even more, though, would be to leave some sort of review, whether a text review or using their proprietary metric will help spread the word to new potential listeners through the magic of algorithms.
So yeah, what a weird week.
How so?
In Geek, right? Just to, talk about criticism and culture.
Yeah, I was not expecting us to go as long on that as we did.
Right.
But,
well, it's the weird thing of like we both brought something that was like, oh, that'll be short, but then the other was like, oh, okay, that's something to talk about. And that's why we have a podcast.
That's called friendship. So
that was us high fiving.
Oh, geez, hold on, my internet's slow. There it is. Okay. So until you high five a friend on the internet, dear listeners, I'm D. Bethel.
And I'm Andrew Asplund.
And for all intents and purposes,
that was a podcast.
So if you, dear listeners, have any thoughts about the topic... I could put a musical bed under that, sure.
Sorry, I was... But I have something else I'm gonna talk about. A new TV show I watched.
Really?
Yeah.
What TV show would that be?
Ha!
Bridgerton?
Ha! No.
Oh.
Matlock.
Oh God, Christ, Andrew.
It's
actually making the show for your dad now?
No, for my mom, actually.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we'll see. I don't know if it might not. I don't know if I'll be able to get to it this weekend.
No stress. I'll try to watch it this weekend.
Let's maybe plan for a couple weeks out, and we'll do
sure.
a Dawn
closer
of the Dead.
to October.
Well, you mean Halloween
sorry.
apostrophe N.
And Halloweeny. Yeah. The new operating system last time. I don't know. I think I did.
2 weeks ago? Was that 2 weeks ago? Did we do one last week? I don't even know. What is time?
What is time but sadness?
Not for nothing. It's 9/11. You're welcome.
Shoot you later.
Attribution license. The use for text music.
Something about algorithms.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, it's a reboot. Okay.
Not even a reboot.
You're not talking about the old show.
No, not the old show. No. Yeah, I didn't just start fucking watching
You watch Columbo, so shut your fucking face.
I don't watch Columbo.
I mean, you watch Murder with Children. Murder
with Children.
Murder, She Wrote. Oh my God.
I'm sorry, actually. Murder with Children is actually really good.